applause. Coming up first, Dr. David Perlmutter. Does he need an introduction? No, but he's going to get one anyway. Board-certified neurologist, fellow of American College of Nutrition, #1 bestseller, Grain Brain, Brain Maker. Let's give it up, y'all. Up next, Dr. Grace Liu, PharmD, trained functional medicine practitioner, founder of the Gut Institute. Little fun fact, little tip to you. You know your gut's on point when your flattest smells like compost. Learn that from Dr. Liu. Applause, everybody. Next up, Dr. Will Cole, graduated from Southern California University of Health Sciences in LA. Functional medicine specialist out of Pittsburgh. You can find him at drwillcole.com. Dr. Michael Ruscio is a clinician, stand-up guy, author, and researcher. He's out of San Francisco, treating people with all sorts of disorders that functional medicine can affect. And finally, Dr. Josh Axe, out of Nashville, natural medicine, chiropractic physician, clinical nutritionist, one of the world's largest health websites at draxe.com. Give it up for him, y'all. So, the science around this changes so much on a year-to-year basis. I mean, it seems like every other week I'm getting dinged via Google for something pertaining to the gut or something we've learned. Why don't we start very quickly with, in the past year, what has been maybe the most aha, myth-busting, or interesting thing that the science has kind of taught us about the gut, in your opinion, just personally?
Well, I'll throw out one thing that may be kind of interesting. I'm not sure if this was necessarily in the past year, but for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, we're learning that one of the mechanisms that may underlie that is an autoimmune attack that can damage the part of the intestines that's responsible for moving food through the intestinal tract. And there are certain treatments and certain tests that can be done to quantify that. So for people that have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth that keeps coming back, this motility, this autoimmune damage may be responsible for that. And what's even more interesting is that autoimmunity can be triggered after a bout of what's known as acute gastroenteritis, or quite simply food poisoning or stomach flu, throwing up, diarrhea. So for people who have this, I'm really sensitive to foods, I have IBS, I'm not sure why, it can be a bit of a I guess, burden off their shoulders, where now you know what the thing is that's driving that. So that's one thing I throw out there.
Because let's start with basics. The thing that was the most amazing to me actually in the last year was just that as we get better measures, which actually will segue into the next question, we get better at being able to measure actually how much bacteria is in the gut, how much DNA they have, or how do we actually measure this stuff? Like when we talk about the gut microbiota and research on stool samples, how reliable is that? Has that improved in the past years? I mean, I've seen some researchers out in the field getting enemas of like a Hadza stool to rebuild their gut. Clinically, does this have value? Is it? I mean, just talk about that. Talk about how we actually measure this stuff in people, rather because it's an amorphous process. It's like, oh, if my gut hurts, then maybe I need more probiotics, maybe I need more resistant starch, maybe I need this product. But how would they start to actually determine what they actually need?
Oh, I can go for this. Cool. I think it's really wonderful that we have tools now to look at what's in the gut. We have uBiome, there's a kit from Thrive, and there's all the functional medicine testing that a lot of us use, from Genova Labs, Great Plains Lab, CDSA from Dr. Zeta, and many others. I've actually gone to a really progressive kit called a urine organic acid kit, because you can see fungal overgrowth, just as Dr. Ruscio was talking about, and bacterial overgrowths, and more importantly, Clostridium overgrowths. A lot of people, after getting lots of antibiotics, get overgrowths in Clostridium, and it can knock out motility. So when you knock out motility, you knock out mood, sleep, athletic performance, all kinds of things that go along with that. And then you're a prime target for autoimmune disease, chronic inflammatory conditions. Everything's related to the gut now. So one of the biggest things I find in this year now is that poo is everything. It brains. And when you know more about your poo, then you're going to help your health. And yeah, hods of poo may be great for us, but probably because we're genetically not so similar, it's probably going to be a mismatch on the immune level as well as other status levels like nutrigenomics. I look at things like ATG16L and FUT2. You're probably familiar with these. These are kind of disruptions that make it a little harder for people to hold on to the good core probiotics. Thanks.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
And to build on that with what we're continuing to learn about the gut, the small intestine is kind of like this forgotten part of the GI, right? So you have your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, large intestine, rectum. And we can easily assess the rectum predominantly with stool samples, but the small intestine is often overlooked, and it's oftentimes left out of the dialogue. And if you're on the internet and you're doing some research and you're hearing about stool samples that are taken from hunter-gatherers, you have to be really careful with how much you extrapolate from that, because while that data is very interesting and very valuable, the small intestine represents over 56% of your digestive tract. It's responsible for 90% of caloric absorption. It's the section of your gut that's most amenable to leaky gut because the membrane is the most thin, and it has the largest density of immune cells in the entire body. So the small intestine, I think, the further appreciation we're gathering regarding the small intestine is changing the way we look at gut health. Now, the small intestine, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute, but that can be assessed via a breath test. So it can be helpful to have multiple types of testing, as I know we all do, to get windows into these different things. But one of the things that I think I maybe have a different opinion on than maybe kind of like the standard party line is some of the recommendations for the small intestine and the large intestine are different. Large intestine, it seems like we want to feed bacteria, but for people who have problems in the small intestine, if you focus on feeding bacteria, you may make the problem in the small intestine worse. And so then you come to a question of what's more important. Should I focus on a diet that's good for the large intestine or the small intestine? If you come back to what I said a moment ago, where the small intestine represents over 56% of the GI, 90% of caloric absorption, the majority of the immune system, more prone to leaky gut, I would argue we need to start shifting the way we look at dietary and other recommendations to be a little more small intestine centric than large intestine centric. It's getting too deep, but
No. Well, we can back that up and make it a little more. How available are these? You mentioned breath. I mean, stool. How available are these measures and tests to actually determine this? I mean, I don't know if I can go to any lab test now. Obviously, there are the mail order kits you discussed, but I couldn't, short of a doctor who's willing to bill, bill for insurance for something like that. How available is this stuff for us to start to make these determinations?
You're not going to get these tests with a typical mainstream doctor. My patients are asking for it, but it really comes down to insurance. Does insurance cover these labs? Largely speaking, no. So you're going to have to seek out a functional medicine doctor to really dig deeper into the things you're talking about.
But that being said, I've been exploring the insurance system, and I have found for the SIBO breath test, for example, excellent coverage. And I've also found some of the big box labs, like LabCorp and Quest, that sometimes get a bad rap in functional medicine, have actually done a pretty good job with some stool testing, and that is billable to insurance. You have to dig a lot harder for the codes to get the markers that you want, and it's like 24 codes that you have to put in on the lab rec. But that can be helpful if someone does have a good insurance plan. They are kind of strapped for cash. So I think the landscape there is starting to change a little bit, thankfully.
So I would say that there's a big difference between wanting to look at your stool because you have pathology versus what is ideal for me. What would be the best? What should my gut bacteria look like in order for me to resist disease, maybe extend longevity? And I don't think we're at a place yet, although UBiome published a report about a week and a half ago where they started looking at what constitutes, what do you correlate certain patterns of gut bacteria, how does that correlate with being generally healthy? So the point is we do not yet have any real sense as to what when we talk about dysbiosis, when the gut bacteria are in disarray, what is eubiosis? What is a normal gut bacterium, a bacterial array? And frankly, the comments earlier about the Hadza stool. The Hadza is an African population that apparently has a really good microbiome, very healthy. But for you to consider that you would want to have a fecal transplant from somebody who is ostensibly healthy to repopulate your gut with their bacteria is that necessarily a good idea? Well, their gut bacteria is probably what is healthiest for them. Might not be communicating appropriately with you in terms of your genome, in terms of your lifestyle choices, and most specifically in terms of your diet. The Hadza, for example, eat a lot of animal product, but they also eat a lot of baobab fruit, which happens to be a very powerful prebiotic. So that said, there are, for example, the American Gut Project, which is run by Dr. Rob Knight at UCSD, is a $99 test that anybody can do. American Gut Project is what you could Google. You don't need a doctor to do it. But you're going to end up with all kinds of great information that delineates the various numbers of species that you have and some representation of how much of each species you have. So now what? Now that you have that information, what does it mean? Is it good or bad? And what should you do about it? And I believe that we're still a long way, maybe not a long way, but we're a ways away from knowing how to make specific recommendations just based upon the bacterial array for an individual. Far more important, I believe, is what's called the metabolome. In other words, what are the species doing? What are the end products that are coming out from these species that then have characteristics that we can measure when we look at various forms of data? How might these parameters that we can measure affect inflammation, affect blood sugar regulation, etc.? And that's far more important. When we can begin to draw correlations between certain groups of bacteria and metabolomic information, then I think we're going to be a lot closer to making specific recommendations.
I think that's a fantastic point, and maybe to help the audience, we can draw a loose delineation between, because the term microbiota is used very loosely, and so I look at this like there's microbiota tests and there are clinical gut tests. Now, a microbiota test would be something like an American gut, a ubiome. You get all these phylogenetic trees. You get to know what the whole world of bacteria in your gut looks like. And to Dr. Perlmutter's point, we don't really know what to do with that yet. Other side of the fence, though, a clinical test is something that has a treatment that is indexed to it, and that's very important. So if someone comes back with positive SIBO or positive Candida, or potentially positive for blastocystis hominins, or definitely for H. pylori, especially if they have ulcers and other gastric type symptoms, then we know that there are treatments that have been studied and shown to be effective based on those treatments. So it's an important delineation. There are microbiota tests, more research-based. We want to support those to learn more, but they don't really tell you what to do. And then you have clinical tests, which have treatments that are tied to them. And one other thing, sorry, I'm going to ramble because I just love the topic of the gut so much. The Hadza, hunter-gatherers, as an example, different people will have adaptations in the gut that help them survive to their diet, to their environment. The highest colonization of Methanobrevibacter smithii, which is a type of, it's actually an archaea, it's not a bacteria, it's like a cousin of a bacteria. The highest density of those is found in African populations. Now, they cause a methane-positive SIBO breath test, and when we find that in Westerners, that correlates with constipation, bloating, and weight gain. It probably helps the Hadza because it slows down transit, which is, for them is helpful because they eat a very high-fiber diet, which can be laxating. They also eat less calories, so one theory is if you slow down transit, you can extract more calories from the food. But you do that in a Westerner with a different diet, now you get constipation, you get weight gain. So we have to be careful with how much we pull from other cultures and try to say, well, the Hadza have like no autoimmunity and healthy guts, so let's take their microbiome and shift it and force it into us. And I think in a lot of cases that's potentially a recipe for disaster. So really agree with your points.
So it almost sounds like we talk about acute versus chronic health conditions. It's almost like you have acute gut issues and then chronic gut issues that we almost measured by the metabolomic signatures, and then there's many ways up the mountain, right? Because it sounds like y'all are saying that there's no one healthy gut. That like a paleo diet for somebody who is in the South Pacific versus somebody who might be in north of the or near to the North Pole, it's going to look entirely different based on the circumstances and situations they find themselves in. But the end product is of the healthy gut and the positive fallout that results from that is the same. And so that really does knock off one question that if you're chasing down a sort of idyllic, perfect hunter-gatherer society to drag stool from, that's highly situational. So So it does sound like all these individuals though have good diets, right? Good seasonal, they're eating real food. So could you still have gut problems with a great diet? A real clean, healthy paleo diet?
I love this answer, question, and my response would be, yeah. I mean, I have vegans come to me, whole food plant-based, but they've damaged something and seek to heal that. And when you look at the gut, even a vegan diet, which is really high plant-based, prebiotics, they're missing a lot of the core probiotics that we know are really healthy for life. Like you want a balance of archaea. Mike talked about archaea and methana brevi. If you're healthy and you have plenty, you're lean and you're less likely to be diabetic and you're super insulin sensitive. But if you have too much, that's associated with anorexia. And then that's too much satiety to the point where people don't want to eat anymore. So we look to balance that. And they may or may not show up on SIBO breath testing. That's my problem with certain testing, which are shown to not really have reliability, like a 30-40% reduction in reliability, sensitivity, and specificity. You'll miss the diagnosis. So it's awesome. I love working with all kinds of clients. I work with executives, MMA fighters, endurance athletes, and multitasking moms. We reduce body fat, brain fog, and fatigue in 6 months or less. And in our group class, in one-on-one consultation in group class, we teach people how to look at the urinary oat test because, as Dr. Perlmutter mentioned, this test is really awesome. It shows you metabolites. It's almost like the metabolome proteome that we can look at now. Even though the testing is not perfect, you can see a lot of the overgrowths that show up there because they're leaking out of your small intestines. You see 9 markers for urinary fungal overgrowth biometabolites, over 8 or 9 for bacterial, and then 4 for the Clostridium, which is awesome. And I love to focus on something called oxalates. It's, we have some people in the paleo diet sphere who can't tolerate oxalates. But in nature, all of Mother Nature's food are covered in oxalates. It protects the plant because it's her seed, it's her DNA. And we want these foods, they're super nutritious. They're high in oils, omega-3s, like all the seeds and nuts and grains and lentils. But if we're missing probiotics, we don't break down oxalates. So really, it's not really an oxalate, a kale allergy, right? Or almond allergy. It's really actually people are missing what we know are good bifido, good lacto, and oxalobacter, soil probiotics, and prescriptosis, which is on environmental stage. These probiotics are shown to lower oxalates. And they're really helpful for vulvodynia, breast tenderness, where there's a lot of masses, calcifications. These are all calcium oxalates. And they come from fungal overgrowth. So overwhelmingly what I see is when we look at aspergillus and fungal overgrowth on the urinary oat, like the furans and all these other markers, it's from fungal overgrowth. Because once we wipe out good bacteria with antibiotics and not probiotics, then we get these overgrowths and this overwhelming high oxalates. And I love the urinary oat because it shows 3 markers for oxalic acid and other oxalates. And we need glutathione and antioxidants. When we get sick and our adrenals whose adrenals here are fried? Too much cold brew coffee, maybe. Then we don't have enough antioxidants and glutathione, and then we produce even more endogenous oxalates because it's just a pollution marker. That's all.
Yeah, and I'll add this and say this as well. I think the question was, can somebody be eating a paleo diet or a really healthy diet and still have issues with the microbiome? And my answer is absolutely yes. And there's a lot of other factors outside of diet that cause these issues. And I'll say, patients I've taken care of, I would say 50% of the time, just as much as diet, emotional stress will absolutely change the gut microbiome, and there's some good research on that as well. So, I think as clinicians, one of the things I see a lot of my colleagues doing an incredible job of is also, bringing in or even recommending people really work on changing their lifestyle, reducing those stress levels. So I do think that's another important thing. And just to jump on another thing here as well, I think in terms of the gut microbiome, Dr. Perlmutter kind of alluded to this as well, but everybody's microbiome is going to be different, and I think based on where you're living, the region that you grew up in and the region where you're going to be really depends on the gut microbes you need. There's a good study out of Japan that found that those people in that area around Okinawa actually digested seaweed much better and actually had microbes in their gut that better broke those things down. And if you're a person who is in the middle of in the landlocked, you don't necessarily need those same microbes, but you probably need something else. So I think one of the biggest things and best things we can do for our gut microbiome is lower stress levels and really take the stress off the body, sort of allowing our body to adapt to our surroundings.
Well, that kind of jumps into another nice point, which is, if you believe, so it's a question and a comment, right? The question is focusing on the gut a cure-all? And the comment is because if you believe it to be so and you're still sick, could you imagine the stress that you're putting on yourself, making your condition worse? It's this wonderful downward spiral feedback loop.
Yeah, I think Hippocrates said, we've all heard this, but all disease begins in the gut, but just because it begins there, and I would actually even argue maybe it actually begins here in a lot of cases. So, but I think there's that gut-brain connection, but I think that I think in most cases it does begin in the brain or the gut, and so I think that's where we start oftentimes as clinicians, and start in those areas, but I don't always think it has to.
And what I would offer the audience, because you may be struggling with methylation, detox, mercury, mold, adrenals, thyroid, hormones, where do I begin? I would recommend starting with the gut and then reevaluating. There's a lot of cases where what looks like thyroid symptoms or what looks like adrenal symptoms, even though I don't like the term adrenal fatigue, I think that's a bit antiquated at this point, or what may look like female hormone imbalance symptoms, disappear after you improve the health of your gut. But it's not a cure, right? But if you wanted to organize this in the most efficient hierarchy, start with the gut, see your gut health through to fruition, then reevaluate if your symptoms are all clear or not. And if they're not, move on to something else. That might be thyroid, it might be detox, or what have you.
I would also add that you do not, when we're talking about gut, it's even for the paleo community, you don't necessarily have to have gut symptoms or digestive symptoms to have gut problems. A lot of people are ruling themselves out now and saying, well, I go to the bathroom fine. But we find oftentimes when we do comprehensive labs and are doing a workup, there actually are latent digestive issues or gut microbiome issues that you're seeing the systemic impact somewhere else.
Well, that gets into something interesting. So, how does one? So it seems like everybody that they either believe themselves to have a gut problem, or they think they should have a gut problem because of how they previously eaten, and they take the kitchen sink approach to the supplementation. They just start, I'm going to down potato starch, and I'm going to load up on fiber, and what are the problems with that? And how can they maybe be? Is there a back of the envelope version that y'all can give to address that?
Yeah, I have a thought to start it in that typically less is more. I think that when you look back, and I've read this in sort of some Chinese medicine textbooks and talking about sort of comparing the beginning of life to an end of life, and sort of throwing sickness in there in terms of when somebody's sick, sometimes you want to treat them like a baby. I mean, literally eating a mono diet in many cases can be very beneficial, I think, for a short time, or in adding things back in slowly, really eating very, very simple meals. And one of the things that I teach that, may at first not sound right, but I promise it is that, what food doesn't heal you, your body heals itself. And one of the things and of course, they're building blocks that our body uses to rebuild and heal itself. But I think it's really important to understand that, I think there are great benefits of consuming a diet that's very simple and easy on the body. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people can appreciate, things like bone broth, and it's an amino acid form, just very easy on the body. So I think a lot of times less is more. And simplicity can be better too.
I was going to say that, I see a lot of times people trying to do these well-intentioned things. They're coming to us with all these supplements that are great supplements, but it's a whole cocktail of capsules they're swallowing, and they're not getting any better. And I'm finding more, like less is more, is when we simplify all the capsules they're swallowing, and that alone can alleviate some stress. It just may be too much. And just because something's natural, it may not be right for you. And it's hard when you're on Dr. Google trying to do all these right things for your body to get an objective perspective, I think, sometimes, of like, okay, what's right for you? And less is more.
I completely agree with that also. I think part of the reason why is people's guts are deteriorating, they're becoming more sensitive, more reactive. So the more you take, the more the probability is higher that you're going to be reacting to something you're taking. So something that's intended to help is actually harming you. So totally in agreement. There's 4 factors I think are important to consider with your diet as a good solid starting point, and I can kind of codify these for you. The first is allergenicity. And that's addressed by the paleo diet, or a step further, the autoimmune paleo diet. Allergenicity 1. 2 is fermentability, meaning how robustly the food you eat feeds your bacteria. And for, I think, the initial phase, it's better to use a lower fermentable approach in case you have overgrowths, to kind of starve out those overgrowths. And so this is addressed by the low FODMAP diet or the low FODMAP with SCD combination diet. So allergenicity, fermentability, and then the third is your carbohydrate content. Some people do better on higher carb, some people do better on lower carb. The interesting thing is, when you go on a paleo and or a low FODMAP type diet, you tend to restrict carbs inadvertently because you're limiting a lot of those foods. So by naturally addressing items 1 and 2, you visit a lower carb diet. Then you're going to want to try to later reintroduce the foods that you cut out and try to get to the broadest diet possible. So that's where you go through the carbohydrate reintroduction as well as the allergen and fermentable food reintroduction. The other factor, the fourth, is meal frequency. Some people clearly do better on 2 meals a day, 2 larger meals a day. Other people do better on 3 or 4. And to the question of does skipping a meal damage your metabolism, we went through a fairly comprehensive review in the literature on this. Most of the data shows no negative change. Some of the data shows benefit. So you see a net neutral to slight benefit from skipping a meal. So to say that fasting is going to slow down your metabolism, I think, is an antiquated concept that came from like the 80s fitness bodybuilding community about frequent meals and insulin management. But now that we're learning more about fasting, you can kind of throw that out. So allergens, fermentability, carb content, and meal frequency. If you can fool around with those, then I think you can take a huge step toward dialing in the diet that will be ideal for you.
I'll just say one last quick thing here. This is more of a mental state, but one of the issues too, I had a patient come into my clinic one time with 2 whole food bags full of supplements. She was taking 80, 90 pills a day. And I told her, I'm like, you have really expensive urine right now. I said, there's some of this stuff, it's just going in and right out. But I think a lot of times we think a pill fixes us. And I think that's another thing as clinicians, really working with patients and letting them know, we just need to transform everything. We need to, you need more relaxation. You need to get out and do some grounding and walking and scheduling in times of joy and, just really explaining and helping them understand that, again, we've all heard this, but this is a lifestyle thing. You really want to transform your diet and these things, but really getting them out of that mindset of a pill can heal me.
Yeah, I totally agree. Have you guys heard of the term Biotrain? So Michael really explained well the small intestines. It's a huge biotrain. It's as big as a tennis court. So it's really hard to clean that up when it gets overgrowth. I liken it for my clients and people fans of the gut. It's like cleaning it with a toothbrush. It's pretty hard. And you can do all kinds of diet modulations, but you really want to track things so you know things are changing. And what I see is on health modulation, all symptoms of food allergies, fatigue, brain fog, and body fat issues, they start improving when the modality affects the lab testing. So always test, don't guess. It's just like a sprained ankle. With our gut, we can sprain it, and you may not even know it. You may not even know the bone is sticking out and how damaged it is because antibiotics and other things, it's so subtle, and we don't have pain receptors in the gut. But I would agree totally with Josh Axe that we have to look at our biotrain of our emotions too. I work with a lot of people and they're stressed, executives, multitasking moms, athletes who are getting hit and many concussions. And we want to protect all that, and especially the second brain in the gut, right, Dr. Promoter? So don't miss my talk on Sunday because I talk about oxytocin and ways how oxytocin heals our gut. But we want to try to do forest bathing, being out. Have you heard of forest bathing? They're antidepressant chemicals released by plants and trees. And we're missing out when we're indoors and living on concrete and not inhaling all this. There's so many ways for us to change our biotrain, and I would encourage all of you to try to explore all of them as close to our ancestry as you can, and you'll see all kinds of health benefits flourish from that, including your gut.
So there's this big dichotomy then between what are the broad strokes that we could sit here and talk about that are generally the right recommendations that are good for everybody, versus this whole notion of personalized medicine, what is good for each and every one of you as an individual. And I think that's where there's a lot of struggle because people hear these generalities and think maybe that's good for me, but then again, my family has X, Y, or Z. But I think some of the things that Dr. Axe talked about, stress is bad for everybody, I believe. A low level of stress can have positive effects. We call that hormesis. But generally, our lifestyle and watching the news and what's going on around us, the stress that we're under, I think, is destabilizing for us. I will go out on a limb and say I think sugar is bad in all of its forms. Again, somebody could argue the point. I think artificial sweeteners are bad. I think we need to get restorative sleep. I think it's very important. And I think expressing gratitude is one of the general broad strokes that we all need to embrace, in my opinion. But beyond that, what are the uniquenesses of our lifestyle choices that are best for us? And I think that's where we are. That's why there are various startups right now looking at biometrics, at genomics, at metabolomics, and trying to ultimately come up with the best recommendation for each and every one of you as an individual. So we're all walking this line of the broad strokes versus what's best for me and based upon my heritage, what time of year it is, where I'm living, etc. And I think that continues to be a very evolving kind of story that we have to keep on top of. There are no rock solid answers to that question right now.